I got to take my own anxiety to God first so that I can use that as my trump card as I lead my people. I'm the non-anxious guy in the room that don't have all the answers, but I'm walking closely with the one who does.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I get the pleasure of sitting across from Dr. Richard Blackaby today.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for bringing your daughter, Claire, with you today. That always makes seeing you come much more palatable.
It eases the burden. Yeah, well, I do what I can, Richard. You know, I'm just trying to keep you around. So.
Oh yeah, all those women of yours at your home.
Yeah. No, they certainly keep me busy. Well, there seems to be a lot said these days, if you look online, especially. But there's a lot being talked about in the realm of anxiety. It seems that everyone's discovering that they're just an anxious person, or
they become one. Yeah,
they become one if they're not already. Certainly through the COVID pandemic and everything, that I feel like anxiety certainly peaked at that time, and I think there's a lot of residual anxiety from that, and we're obviously staring down the barrel of a big major U.S. election in the not too distant future. And so naturally people are anxious about that. And we recently had Alan Fadling on the podcast to talk about his new book, A Non-Anxious Life. Yeah. And you recently read a book by Mark Seyers, A Non-Anxious Presence. And so we've sort of been in this
non-anxious world,
a non-anxious sort of trend that's happening on the podcast. And so I know you've got some thoughts based on that, and just based on your reading, but talking to Alan and just your own thinking on sort of, we live in what seems like a very anxious time.
Yeah, and Sayers is he's an author, a cultural commentator, a speaker. He lives in Australia, I think in Melbourne. And so one thing about this book that's interesting is that he cites a lot of people not in North America, and that's sort of a bit uncommon. I think he must do that on purpose, where he'll say this writer from India or this writer from Spain, or places that we're not as familiar with a lot of these voices. And so,
well, it certainly feels like, and this is probably just a product of living in the U.S., but it seems like U.S. is sort of epicenter of anxiety. Yeah. At least that's where that seems to be where.
And I would just say that a lot of times when I read a book, say of someone in England or Australia or even Canada, and then they're offering commentary on the United States, it's a lot of times I'll just sort of feel like, okay, I think they mean well, but they're getting all their information secondhand. And if they lived here, they would know it might not be quite the way they describe it, or
right.
And so I'm always a little cautious about that. Not that you can't learn from people from other countries, and sometimes their perspective really is helpful. It's fresh, and but sometimes also you just get the sense they're just watching perhaps maybe a liberal or some kind of slanted news source to get all their information, and then they're commenting on that as if that's just how it is. And you might say, well, if you live here, it's not quite like that. Mm-hmm. But to his credit, I say all that to say I think that Sayers does a pretty good job of remaining fairly objective and not kind of crossing the line where he exposes perhaps the fact he doesn't really know America as well, and he calls the 20th century basically America's century. It was the most dominant country. Mm-hmm. He would say that, of course, with the rise of the internet and the online networked community now that we are in, and the rise of other powers like China and so on, that he would say the world is definitely changing. And as he writes this book, the COVID pandemic is very much on the table that he's responding to, and he says some interesting things I think that we've touched on as well. But he uses some terms I thought were interesting, and he calls he talks about a gray zone, and to him, Sayers means a gray zone is a time between eras where one era is declining. It's not the influence of that era is not necessarily done yet, but it's waning, and a new era is coming, but we're not quite sure what that's going to be like. And so we're in this kind of gray zone where things are unclear a little bit. And so he begins the book talking about the famous Krakatoa volcano that happened in Indonesia, August 27th, 1883. That's kind of his opening kind of imagery he gives, where that was maybe the most powerful volcano, at least that we know of. It was heard for, 1,000 miles away. You could hear the explosion. For a year, the debris in the sky and the atmosphere was still circulating around the Earth. Over 36,000 people were killed. It was on an island, and the island itself was refashioned. I mean, parts of the island disappeared. 2 mountain peaks were blown away, weren't there anymore. The vegetation, everything was just kind of charred and burnt up to a crisp, and you just looked, and it looked like a nuclear holocaust had taken place on that island. And it just looked like such a catastrophe that the world had never seen. And now there's nothing left living there, plants or vegetation, animals, whatever. But then, like, scientists would start going back months, even years later, and to their surprise, what looked like a charred ruin, there was new life coming, new plants popping up, even new animals arriving. And it was a fascinating study where you thought, okay, everything's done. The way life was before is over. But you would never have imagined that there were all kinds of seeds of life that would spring forth, and that there'd be a whole new era that would come after that. And so that time of sort of charred ruin, dust and smoldering ashes, was kind of a gray zone where there's just no way you could predict what life would be like on that island. Mm-hmm. And so he kind of uses a lot of that imagery to talk about things like COVID, because he says we're coming out of an industrial age, and an industrial age is a time where it's predictable. You sort of know, like, if you do follow these processes, you're going to get these kind of results. And you assume that you're in a stable environment, so you can predict 5-10 years out and have a reasonable idea of what will be coming in the future. There's always a few surprises here and there, but nothing that is totally paradigm shifting. It's just, some years you have less rain than others, or whatever, but you kind of know that over time it's going to all work out a certain way. And so leading in an industrial age, in many ways you're more of a manager. You just manage processes and people. And so Sayers would say a lot of churches function that way. You knew you were going to crank out a service every week. You knew you had certain church programming. You knew you needed to communicate with your congregation. You knew that there'd be ups and downs here and there, but basically you could predict, you could come to a church and think, okay, well, I'll implement my program, and 20, 30 years from now, when I get ready to retire, the church should be around here. It should be doing this. And that worked well for the 20th century for the most part. But then along came COVID, and all of a sudden it was, and he uses the idea of a virus to say viruses are shifty sort of things. Like they find new ways. If you have a certain vaccine or a certain response to it, it's constantly morphing and looking for new ways of multiplying and continuing and spreading.
Yeah, it's certainly not a stagnant thing.
No, and it can multiply very quickly, as we saw worldwide. Because the world is networked, something that happens in maybe a small town in China can shut down the world. And so, and of course that also can be true of hackers, people, internet terrorists, or just global terrorists. A small group of people now can magnify their influence greatly. And large countries, large armies, large economies can be brought down and humbled by a relatively small number of people. And so the world has changed in many, many ways. If you have a few, I mean, churches have always had a few malcontents, but now you get just a handful that begin to post, put up a new page and have all kinds of videos and complaints, and they message all the people in your church, and a few people can cause all kinds of disruption now, unlike perhaps in times past. And so Sayers is saying that we're in a gray zone right now. We're not sure exactly how life's going to be. Certainly change has accelerated rapidly, and the internet, computers, mobile phones, all those things are changing the way life is experienced, and we're not sure yet how that's going to affect a lot of what we're experiencing right now. So that's very very unsettling. And Sayers would say that one of the oldest ways that people have managed to survive is first of all that they develop strongholds, and these strongholds are safe places. And if you're living on your own and there's all kinds of enemies and predators and bad people out there, you're gonna be constantly anxious because just there's always danger lurking. But if you develop a stronghold and where you can feel safe behind those walls, and you know the system, and strongholds have hierarchies of rule and organization, and they have certain stories that they use to explain kind of reality. And so he would say that essentially the United States in many ways has been a stronghold for the world, for peace, for democracy, freedom, and so on. And so the U.S. has dominated how a lot of things are done, down to economies and money and culture and so on. But Sayers would say that, as someone who lives in Australia, that although the U.S. still is arguably the most influential country still, it doesn't have the same dominance that it used to. And now with computers and other things, the way that influence is exerted is changing. And so what he would say is he says, once the legitimacy of a stronghold is questioned, it no longer absorbs our anxiety. Instead, it becomes the source of our anxiety. And so he's saying that those things that used to make us feel safe, those things that used to protect us from danger, are crumbling now. They're not able to keep up. There's leaks. There's gaps in the wall. And so he would say that's creating a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. And
people don't feel safe anymore. And what else he would say is, when you don't have a good stronghold, he would say we tend to resort back to tribes. And he would say before there were strongholds, before there were castles across Europe and so on, in the Middle Ages, you lived in tribes, and those tribes were your safety, and you all were connected. You had a similar story, similar life. And he said, with strongholds breaking down that normally would hold society together, we're going tribal more and more again. And of course, the internet facilitates that. And so you go on the internet and you find other people that have similar values and similar fears and similar perspectives, and so you link together. And he says, for discontents, social media offers a chance to find a lever of protest, to forge new online tribes of the disaffected. And because he says it's a decentralized world now, you have all these different tribes that are vying for loyalty and to get their voice out. And so basically he says that now this is it's a gray zone period of time, and no one knows for sure how everything's going to pan out in the end. So the question comes for Sayers is, so what kind of leader should you be at a time like this, when people are anxious, and he says one of the dangers actually of an anxious-filled society is that he says a lot of people, what they're doing is they're building their own stronghold, and their stronghold is what he calls self, the stronghold of self. And we've looked at some books that have talked about the self before, but he says the problem with that is that we want self to be our fortress, and that gives us a great amount of autonomy and freedom to kind of be whoever we want to be. The problem is that self is not necessarily sustainable on its own, and although you want to let self kind of be your fortress, you still depend upon people's opinions and what other people do.
Yeah.
And so you're not nearly as independent. We want to talk about the freedom just to be me, but you don't have the power. You're not big enough, strong enough just to maintain that on your own. You have to rely upon tribes, other people. And so he says that he has a great discussion on just wildernesses and just the idea that back in the biblical times, wildernesses were not like the American frontier necessarily, where you went out and conquered the wilderness, but it was a place of foraging, testing. He talks a lot about kind of comparing David and Saul, and says, David grew up the first part of his life in the wilderness, and actually he gets anointed to be king, but then ends up going back to the wilderness for a time. And he's growing. He's being humbled by the wilderness. And so Sayers would say the gray zone is something of a wilderness for us. It's a place that can either really discourage you and confuse you, or can grow you. And another thing he talks about is just a concept we're familiar with, which is the comfort zone. And he says our culture has created the idea of comfort zones, the idea we can be both successful while avoiding discomfort. But he says comfort zones are dependent on strongholds and their ability to deliver us comfort and ease. And he says the choice to prioritize comfort, ease, and good feelings above growth is the choice to embrace and accept personal, spiritual, and emotional immaturity. And it's interesting, he says, because we're such an anxious society right now, and people just want to be comfortable. I just don't want to be worried about that. I don't want to be discomforted. And so he has kind of an interesting comment about the fact that a lot of networks these days, you spend all your time trying to keep your people comfortable. And he says the danger with that is that you end up letting the lowest common denominator kind of control an organization. And so, Sam, I think you and I both have been a part of groups where the most troubled, anxious, fearful person kind of set the tone for everybody else. It's like, okay, let's move forward. But you got one person that's anxious and scared and worried about that. So, okay, well, let's not move forward right now then. Let's wait. And, we got to think about the people that might get left behind, the people that are afraid. And so he says, and I think we've both seen this, where it's not that you don't care about your people, but you can't let those who just want to be comfortable and, I don't want to change. How will that turn out? What will I have to give up? Well, in fact, he says that sometimes we're so busy trying to just manage our daily pain that we can't perform needed critical surgery to kind of become the organization we need to be. And he has some great things to say about that. He says, for King Saul, one of the problems for him was that he came into success too soon, that he's made king before he's really developed his character, whereas David takes a lot longer and spends a lot more time in the wilderness. And so the wilderness is not seen as an enemy, as a bad thing. And Sayers has an interesting description of just seeds. In fact, I think I'd read this before, but they apparently found some seeds at Masada, where King Herod's fortress, that were like 2,000 years old. And they ultimately planted some of those seeds, and they took off. Like they started growing 2,000 years later. Yeah. And Sayers' point is those seeds have a protective coating that until a certain amount of pressure comes to bear on them, new life, the potential is never experienced. And so he would kind of say, there's times where there's some seeds of leadership potential in us that are never going to really be discovered unless a certain amount of pressure it comes to bear on them.
Yeah.
And that happens in the wilderness, he would say. So it won't happen if you keep trying to be comfortable. And so, he one other thing he said I thought was interesting. There's a lot of interesting little insights and things he mentions. He does mention Alan Hirsch, who is a church leadership guru from Australia that apparently is a friend of his, who talked about people that were trying to develop their skills at playing chess. And Hirsch said that some folks, like, sometimes you rely too much on your queen because your queen is like the most powerful instrument you've got at your disposal. And so you just kind of immediately want to get that lady into the game as quick as you can to wreak havoc on the enemy. But he said there's times where chess players, when they're starting out, they'll take the queen off the board. They'll have to try to learn how to use knights and bishops and rooks and other things, pawns. And when they learn how to use all the assets at their disposal, then they can bring the queen back in the game. It's just one tool. You don't lean on too heavily. And so Hirsch said that for churches, the morning worship service was the queen. It was the prime thing they did. That so much of what drove the church was what happened in the service. And so Hirsch kind of made the observation that a lot of churches suddenly, when they couldn't meet in person in a worship service setting, he was like removing the queen off the board and saying, okay, well, you've got other assets here. You just haven't used them. You've never developed them. And so basically, until pressure came to bear, a lot of churches never did utilize a lot of the resources that they had available to them. And so I like just a comment or two about this book and some of these concepts. I would say we are in a gray zone. That's a great word, I think, to describe that. We are in an anxious time. There's all kinds of studies, surveys showing that, especially for young people, but I think for all people, there's a much higher level of anxiety than there was a decade or more ago.
Yeah.
And if you're a leader, that you don't get to choose the necessarily the culture that you lead in or the times in which you lead in. You lead today, and whatever today is like, that's what you got to lead with. And so we could all wish, we can hunker down and just wait until things are easier. But I think our world, our society is desperately looking for people that can be non-anxious. And so what Sayers, I think the crux of this book is he's saying that in an anxious world, a leader's greatest tool is going to be a non-anxious presence. And that doesn't mean that you don't know how to communicate and delegate and do other things, but what people are really looking for in a leader today is someone who's not afraid, who's not anxious.
Yeah.
And he would say for a Christian leader that your non-anxious life comes from the presence of God in your life. And he has a couple of great quotes about that. That if you're disconnected from God in an anxious time, you're going to be in big trouble. But if you are walking closely with God, God's always known that this time in history would come, and He's fully prepared to know how to make a difference. And one of the things I wish that Sayers had done more of was talk not just about leaders, but also just the church in general. Because we talked about this during COVID, that I think it was a great missed opportunity for the church when non-Christians, when unbelievers were filled with dread and anxiety over COVID and other things. It was a great opportunity for Christians to demonstrate non-anxious lives, non-anxious living, to demonstrate the difference that Christ makes in our life. But unfortunately, a lot of us were just as anxious as the unbelievers were. And so I think, my dad used to always say this about leaders. He would say, if you're on a boat in a storm and you see the captain nervously walking up and down the deck, wringing his hands, then all the crew are going to get worried too. But if you see the captain walking calmly, he knows that they're facing some challenges, but he's not afraid. He's not anxious. Well, then that brings a calm to everybody else as well. And so I think certainly when you lead in times of crisis, when you lead in times of uncertainty, of anxiety, you have to draw upon certain skills that become more important. And I think certainly in an anxious time as leaders, whether it's in our home with our own families, our kids, if they hear the parents nervously, anxiously discussing all the problems that they're facing, that's going to create anxiety in the kids. If your employees see you all troubled and nervously walking past them in the hallway to some critical meeting, all kinds of speculation, worry is going to develop as well. But can you take your problems to God and your faith to your people, as my dad used to always say? It doesn't mean you don't have problems. It doesn't mean you put your head in the sand. But you realize that we will get through this. We will get to another place. And kind of like, they say in forest fires, that there's all kinds of acorns and seeds lying on the ground that need a certain amount of heat and pressure before they burst open. And so what can seem like a crisis, as much of the old is falling apart, is actually the very seedbed that's going to, in the environment that's going to cause new seeds, new life to come forth. And so I'm one, I've got a PhD in history. I like the past. I like studying it. But I also know we're not going to the past. That's not where we're headed. And so I've just learned that even if I really like how certain things are at the moment, you embrace it, you enjoy it, but you don't hold on too tightly, because we live in a rapidly changing world. And while other people are fearful of the future, or they're clinging to the past and don't want to change, I think leaders have to be that non-anxious presence that says, well, we can't necessarily change the times in which we live. Things are going to change whether we want them to or not. But we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be anxious about it. Change can, we'll have to let go of some things that we might really miss. But there's some new things coming that we don't even know about yet that we're actually going to really enjoy, that will be great. And so let's just take all that life has for us, but as a leader, let me help you navigate it. And I'm first of all going to just cultivate my own walk with God, develop my own humble dependence on God, so that I'm not afraid, and I'm confident, and I'm creative, and I'm willing to embrace something brand new. I was just with a ministry leader this past week that is leading an older organization that clearly times are changing. Clearly, they can't do things the way that they've always done them. But there's some older members who have fond memories of how it was done in the 60s and 70s, and they just kind of hate it that these younger generations don't appreciate what was done back then. And this leader is trying to say, well, I don't want to just do things out of fear, but also I don't want to just hold on to stuff that's no longer working, that doesn't fit the culture, the society in which we live today, the technology that we deal with today, the interconnectedness, the networked world in which we live, the decentralized world in which we live. We've got to just go with hold on to God's hand and say, God, guide us into this unexplored territory of the future, and we just have to trust that you know how to maximize our impact and our influence, and to spread your kingdom. Even though the world keeps changing, your kingdom keeps growing, because you know under every circumstance how to keep building your kingdom and growing your church. And so I think this is a great book to read. I think certainly as a leader, he put some terms, labels on some things. That gray zone, I think, kind of helps explain some things. I think he would say that right now, a lot of things are gray. Things are going to become more defined and more clear over time. We'll get a better sense of how things work. But when you're going through those gray zones, as leaders, that's the time to really step up with your non-anxious game and lead in a non-anxious way. And if you're the most anxious person at the board table, something's wrong. You need to settle that before you ever go into your meeting or before you stand in front of your people. I got to take my own anxiety to God first so that I can use that as my trump card as I lead my people. I'm the non-anxious guy in the room that don't have all the answers, but I'm walking closely with the one who does. And so I think a helpful word for leaders trying to lead in an anxious world, as you said, Sam, a number of books coming out right now on the anxious or non-anxious life, and I think that's because that's where we are, and that's certainly an ailment many, many people are suffering today. And so leaders just need to be aware of that and make sure they're equipped to lead in that kind of world that we're leading in right now.
Yeah, well, that's great. And we'll leave links to the book as well in the show notes if you want to check that out. But until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackbee.org.